to the old Edinburgh hospital today,
Yeah.
is that correct? And you provided a statement to the inquiry. I understand you're content for that statement to form part of your evidence to the Scottish Hospitals inquiry, is that correct?
Yeah, that's fine.
And Mr Bisset, have you got a hard copy of that statement
Yes,
in
I've
front
got
of you?
it in front of me.
Thank you. If you want to look at your statement at any stage to refresh your memory on any point, please do go ahead and do so. Mr Bisset, before we come to talk about your experience and your daughter's experience in the hospitals, I wonder if we could start by you telling us a bit about your daughter before she was diagnosed.
Like any normal child, she was happy, content, always out playing. Then she started getting ill, probably September, October 2018, and she was diagnosed. Well, they thought it was a chest infection or a cold, and then it later developed. They thought it was tonsillitis, so she'd went on a course of antibiotics. That didn't clear it up. They tried her on a different antibiotic, and she seemed to be deteriorating rather than getting any better. So then she ended up at the Borders General Hospital in January 2019.
At the start of January 2019, she was at Borders General Hospital for some tests.
3rd of January 2019, she was sent to the Borders General from her local GP because they couldn't figure out what was wrong. It just she wasn't getting any better. And in fact, her heart rate was racing. Everything she was deteriorating. So it was the 3rd of January 2019 that she went to BGH, and she was then diagnosed with, well, they thought it was ALL from the beginning.
So did they give you a provisional diagnosis of acute lymphoblastic leukemia?
On the Thursday the 3rd, yeah, on that evening. On the 3rd of January, that evening, we got told then that it was more than likely to be acoustic lymphoblastic leukemia, and that she would be transferred to the Edinburgh sick kids.
And just pausing there, Mr Bisset, can I ask how you felt when you received that diagnosis?
Heartbroken. It's, you never ever think that it's that serious. I mean, Charlie, she had been ill on and off, as I say, from autumn, winter. So she had on and off, she was having good days and bad days. So you never think worst case scenario. You always just think, it's kids. It's the time of year they're just picking up infection after infection. But it was a bit soul destroying to get that news.
Okay, thank you, Mr Bisset. And we're going to come on to consider your daughter's experience in more detail, but before we do that, I think it would be quite helpful for all of us just to outline the time frame of your daughter's treatment over both of the hospitals in Edinburgh and Glasgow. So if it's okay, I'm going to just walk you through that, and you can let me know if I'm correct or not as we do that. I understand your daughter was admitted to the old Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital on 3rd January 2019, is that right?
It'd be the 4th.
The 4th, so that's the day after she was at Borders.
Yeah, it was first thing on the 4th. Okay. It was 9 o'clock in the morning we arrived at Edinburgh. It was early.
And she continued to be treated in Edinburgh, I think, as an inpatient and an outpatient until around July 2019.
That's right, yeah.
But during that time, I think going into the summer of 2019, she had a couple of outpatient appointments in Glasgow. Is that right?
That's right, in June.
Yeah, that's fine, and we will come back to talk about those. And then in mid-July 2019, she was admitted to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow, I think, in preparation for a bone marrow transplant. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And she was a patient there on wards 4B, 6A and the PICU, is that right?
That's correct, aye.
Right. Thank you. And I think she was there until November 2020 when she was discharged to the Click Sargent facility, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
And then in December 2020 she was discharged home.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, thank you. And I think since then you indicate in your statement that her care transferred back to Edinburgh for outpatient checkups, is that right?
Yeah, mostly Edinburgh, but there has been some at Glasgow as well. Right,
okay. And I think you indicate in your statement as well that your daughter has had 1 or 2 appointments at the new Edinburgh Children's Hospital, is that right?
That's where she's getting treated now, yeah.
Okay. And just to confirm, Mr Bisset, were you with your daughter during much of her treatment in those hospitals?
Yeah, pretty much all of it.
Mr Bisset, what I'd like to do now is really take your evidence in 2 parts. I'd like to firstly consider you and your daughter's experience in Edinburgh, and then we'll move on to the experience in Glasgow.
Yep.
Mr Bisset, I'd like to ask you to think back now to the time of your daughter's diagnosis, so this is early January 2019. And when your daughter was admitted to the Edinburgh hospital, did the doctors explain to you the type of treatment that she was going to receive?
Yeah, it's every kid that gets diagnosed with leukemia and that get the same first 4-week treatment. So it's the same chemotherapy, no matter where you are in the UK. Every child gets a block of 4 weeks. And then after 2 weeks with Charlie, they done a bone marrow aspirate to see if there'd been any change or condition. Then after the 4 weeks, they do another bone marrow aspirate. And this is when they determine what treatment's best suited for each child individually after they get the results of the first 4 weeks. So every child gets the same treatment for 4 weeks, and then they break it down into what treatment works, they think will work best for each child individually.
Thank you. And what happened after the first four weeks for your daughter?
Well, at the beginning, when we first got diagnosed, I mean, the only thing I knew about leukemia really was bone marrow transplants. And when I did say to the Dr. Susan Baird at Edinburgh about bone marrow transplant, she said, oh, that's way down the line, we don't worry about that too soon. So after the first 4 weeks to go on to the regime C, which is one of the most intense treatments a child will go on for leukemia, Charlie had to be put on that because after the first 2 weeks and then the 4-week bone marrow aspirate, there wasn't much change in Charlie's condition. So they decided that it was the intense chemotherapy treatment that was needed for Charlie. And at this point, this is when they started thinking about we might need to look for a donor for Charlie because she wasn't responding in the way that they had hoped. So then she went on to treatment for another 4 weeks. That took us to the end of February, and that is when they told us that now we have to start looking for the donor.
Thank you, Mr. Bisset. So am I right in understanding that the initial standard UK protocol treatment for the first 4 weeks didn't have the desired effect?
No, it started to do something, but nowhere near a response that they would expect from a child. So.
And Charlie was placed onto a more intense
treatment of
regime,
chemo. It involved 4 or 5 different chemotherapies. So it was an intense 4-week course.
But ultimately, towards the end of February, it was determined that really the direction of travel was a
bone marrow aspirate, they realised that even this wasn't having a desired effect as it should. So it was then that they started to look for a donor.
And just thinking about January and February, Mr. Bisset, was your daughter an inpatient throughout that time?
She was an inpatient for first 4-week treatment. So she got out the end of January to go home for a few days, and then she had to go back in, and this is when we started the regimen C, which was intense treatment. And it was a mixture of inpatient treatment and outpatient treatment. So she'd be in for a couple of days and then we'd be allowed to go home, and we were giving her oral chemo at home. Get chemotherapy every day at home anyway, and then she would have to go back in as an outpatient once a week to receive a different chemotherapy as well. So it was a bit of a mixture in for a few days, out and then back in. And
it would be fair to say she spent a lot of time in the hospital during that time.
Before we went to Glasgow in July, for 6 months of that year, Charlie's probably spent 4 months in the hospital in total. I think we worked out she was at home for 33 days or something in the first 6 months.
Mr. Bisset, you indicate in your statement, I think in around May 2019, there was another change to her treatment.
Yeah, she was put onto blinatumomab, which it was it's not a trial treatment, but it was the first time it had been used on a child as young in Edinburgh hospital. It had been done at other hospitals, but not Edinburgh. So she was in for 28 days on that because she had to be hooked up to this blinatumomab 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It wasn't allowed to stop treatment, and it was to kill the leukemia cells, but it doesn't cure it. It just takes her down to zero. So the blinatumomab would run for the 28 days solid, and then at the end of it, it would show that Charlie was leukemia free, but it didn't cure it. It just meant that they had killed it back enough, and this was to get her, to keep her at a low level for the transplant.
That was effectively a kind of holding position to get you through to the bone marrow transplant stage. And I think you indicate in your statement that it's around about June 2019 that care starts to transition to Glasgow with a view to moving towards the bone marrow transplant.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right? And I think you indicate that that Charlie had appointments in Glasgow at the Queen Elizabeth on the 10th and 11th of June 2019.
Yes.
And she spent some time at the Beatson Hospital then as well?
Yeah, we went in and this was to meet the team at Glasgow, and then we went back at the 10th, 11th of June, and that was to speak to Professor Gibson.
Yep.
And then she went to the Beatson Centre to be shown. She was to receive full body radiotherapy. So this was to be sure how the machine works and how, because you have to get measured for the bed, because the bed has to be a certain set up for the each child. So to make sure that the radiotherapy goes throughout the whole body completely. So she was measured up and fitted for all the bed padding and everything. So it was a way to. So Charlie, when the radiotherapy did start, that it wasn't too scary and all.
Okay.
But it was a meet and greet basically.
Great. Mr. Bisset, I think that's very helpful. I think that would be a good time to pause there and think about the experience in Edinburgh before we move to think about the events in Glasgow, if that's okay with you. Now, you're the first witness who's able to give us detailed evidence about the old Edinburgh Hospital. And so I'm going to ask you some questions to help us understand a bit about the hospital, a bit about the ward that your daughter was on, and the facilities in that hospital.
Yeah. Could
you begin by describing the location of the old Edinburgh Hospital?
Not the easiest for parking, that's for sure. It's next to the meadows in Edinburgh, so, and we received 2 or 3 parking tickets. It's not exactly the best. There's no actual on-site parking, so you're parking on streets and there's constant traffic wardens going round and round the hospital. So in that regard, it's not the best. It wasn't the best ideal location. You just couldn't park anywhere. It wasn't the easiest place to get to and from with a car, that's for sure.
Okay. And just generally speaking, what kind of building was it?
Oh, it's an old building. The old red brick sandstone buildings. You could tell it was old. It was getting beyond its years.
And Mr. Bisset, which ward was your daughter put on?
Ward 2. That was oncology ward in Edinburgh.
I was going to ask you what patients are on Ward 2, so it's oncology patients on Ward 2. Child oncology patients.
Yeah, child cancer ward. So.
Mr. Bisset, could you describe the ward layout? So imagine you're walking into Ward 2. What do you see? Yeah,
you walk into Ward 2 on the old hospital, and as soon as you go in the doors on the left, you've got a door on your left-hand side, and it's the Teenage Cancer Trust. I think that was enough room for 3 beds. That was the teenage bit. Then you had your sink and that, and then on the right-hand side was the tiny wee kitchen for the nurses, for them dishing up the food. And then there was the daycare treatment room just after that on your right-hand side, which was just 1 bed. That's when you would go as an outpatient sometimes. And then you'd go through and then turn left to get onto the actual ward itself. So this was just the beginning, then you turn left onto the ward itself, and there were 6 rooms down the left-hand side of the ward. You're turning down it and you're looking straight down. Got 6 individual cubicle rooms, rooms, and therefore the inpatients. And then you're on the right-hand side's outpatients, so that's like your daycare beds in there. So there was 8 beds on the right-hand side with a reception in the middle. So.
And were those daycare beds on the right-hand side divided off in any way?
No, it was open. It was they had curtains, but no, they weren't in rooms or that. It was just one big. They all had like the old hospitals with the cubicles with curtains.
Okay. And thinking now about the 6 individual private rooms that you've described, I think on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
Were these the inpatient rooms?
Yeah.
Okay. Could you describe the room that you were in?
We first went in, it was room 6, which was big enough for me to get in my wheelchair. The other four rooms weren't, four rooms weren't big enough. 5 and 6 was enough room for me to get in my wheelchair. So when we first went in, Charlie was in room 6, which was at the end of the ward on the left-hand side. It was quite a big room, that one. And you had your own individual, they all had their own wee bathrooms. But it being an old building, even with the heating on, and the time of year, the rooms were freezing. Like, we took in our own fleece blankets and that in the end, because it was just, it's not that the room wasn't fit for purpose, it was the wind would rattle through the old windows. I mean, you could feel the wind coming, blowing right through the room. So in that regard, they weren't the best because they were old, but there was plenty of room in it. But Charlie was constantly freezing.
Quite like to explore a bit more of the detail around the description that you've given of the rooms, if that's okay. So you say you were in a private room, so you had room 6.
Yeah.
When you walk in the room, what do you see in front of
When you walk in, you've got a bed on your right-hand side below the window, and then it was an open space. That's at this side. That's for the parents' fold-out bed, the old Z beds, and a door directly in front of you as you come into the room, and that's your little bathroom. It's got a bath in it, sink, and a toilet. But in the room itself, you had a telly on the wall, a TV on the wall, which half the channels didn't work. It just Freeview wasn't very good in the room. Had to keep a 7-year-old child occupied with no tellies, not the easiest. But in the room itself, it was literally just a bed with the old table. That was it, and an armchair. There was like a hospital chair sitting in the corner. That was it.
And thinking about the ensuite bathroom that's in there, as you've described, you say it had a bath in it, so it was a bath rather than a shower. That set up. Do you happen to know if each of those 6 rooms had ensuite bathrooms?
I think 4 of them did. But you didn't have showers or baths. You just had a toilet and a wash hand basin.
Okay.
So there was a communal bathroom as such for the rest of the rooms, and for the... I mean, sometimes if there was more than 6 kids in, you were out on where the daycare beds would be, you would sleep there at night and the adult beside, so... Yeah. And you would all use the one bath, shower.
I think you're indicating that of the 6 private rooms that were there, they weren't necessarily all of the same
No.
type or style.
No. 6 was the biggest room. If you got 6, that was when the parents used to. If you got 6, you got the bonus because you got room to move. The other 5 were on the small side.
And what sort of equipment was in the room? You've indicated there was a television.
Yeah.
That may or may not have worked at various times. But what other equipment was in the room? Thinking about treatment.
That was it. You had your drip stands, and the drivers for driving the medicines. They were always attached to the drip stands, but that was it in the way of any medicinal items in the room.
And I think you mentioned there that there was a Z bed in the room. Am I right in thinking that's effectively a camp bed that you set?
Aye.
And did you stay there overnight often?
In room 6, yeah, because it was the only room that was really big enough for me to get in with my wheelchair. If Charlie had ever been in room 1 to 5, then it was Kirsty would stay in. I didn't have the luxury. I was going to say I didn't have the luxury PJ loft.
I'm going to come on and ask you some questions about that, Mr. Bisset, in just a moment. But so you were able to stay if you had room 6. If you didn't have room 6, you then had to find an alternative arrangement because none of the other rooms were suitable.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think you've already mentioned problems with the temperature.
Oh, the room was constantly freezing. Okay.
And you were there in January and through the spring, is that right?
Yep.
Okay. And was there heating in the room?
Yeah, radiators, but just because of the draft, it literally was. It was like the window was open. The draft was that bad in the winter that it really did feel like the window had been left open.
Okay. And I think you indicated you had to bring in your extra blankets.
Plenty thick Charlie's own blankets just to keep her happy.
Okay. Thinking back from the room now, so if we think about the other facilities that were on Ward 2, were there any play facilities for the children?
Yeah, you had at the end, after room 6, sort of in the middle of the room, there was a wee room at the end. It was a playroom. But then again, it was a playroom for toddlers, babies and toddlers. So you had the teenage cancer, they had all their Xboxes and their PlayStations. And then in the playroom it had a lot of toys, but it was more for younger ones. So like we said before they moved, it was really all or nothing. So Charlie was kind of in the middle age group, so she didn't really have a lot to play with. So we were bringing in our own. Charlie's right into her art stuff, so she could get art stuff from there. But not just the play facilities. The play facilities weren't the greatest in there. There wasn't enough room. It was a tiny wee room. But they did do the charities done a lot of, like a musician would come in and take them for singing lessons, and so there was loads of other entertainment on in the ward as well as tiny wee playroom.
Was that the Edinburgh Sick Kids charity?
Yeah.
I think you also mentioned Stevie the Clown in your statement.
Oh, that was Charlie's best friend. Stevie was Charlie's #1 fan. She was Stevie's pal. Stevie was the the ward clown, he would come in, he'd entertain all the kids. Now, he was only meant to spend 10, 15 minutes with each child, but Stevie could turn up and 10 o'clock in the morning, he'd still be there at 7, 8 o'clock at night. He got as much out of it as the kids did, but, I mean, Charlie loved it. I mean, he was a clown, but he'd done magic tricks. So he was in the room just about every time he was in, he would come in and see Charlie, and the magic show would be on for at least an hour. So that kept her going. She loved Stevie coming in. So.
And thinking now about the facilities for parents on the ward, were there any kitchen facilities for parents to use?
There was the kitchen, but weren't really allowed to use it.
Was it a staff kitchen rather than a parents' kitchen?
Yeah. But the nurses and the cleaners kept you going with tea and coffee in there.
I think you indicate in your statement that the nurses were very good to you and helped out when they could.
Really good. Yeah.
Yep. Now, thinking about accessibility on the ward, I think you've indicated you're a wheelchair user, Mr. Bisset. Is that
that's right.
correct? How would you assess Ward 2 in terms of wheelchair accessibility?
Not the best. Not much room. Like I said, if Charlie was in rooms 1, 2, 3 or 4, there wasn't much room at all. I mean, there was times I'd have to take the chair and everything out the room so I could get my wheelchair into the room. And then a lot of the time when they're in these rooms, they're in rooms so they're in isolation. So you can't really go taking stuff out the room because they're maybe got an infection at the time, and to protect other children, they're shut in their rooms. So it was never the easiest for getting about in the chair. I mean, like I said, room 6 and Ward 2 was the biggest room, so there was plenty of room. 5 I could manage, the rest of the rooms was tight. But on the ward itself, to get about, there was enough room to get back and forward in the ward itself. Even when daycare was busy, you could still get up and down the ward, no problem.
Okay, so it was really the private rooms that presented the problem.
Aye.
And Mr. Bisset, I'd like to ask you now about the amenities in the hospital more generally, and particularly how you found them in terms of accessibility. Was there a canteen that parents could use?
Yeah, there was a canteen, but it was only open breakfast and lunch, and it wasn't accessible for myself. You had to go outside and then up a flight of stairs to get into the canteen. So if it was just me and Charlie, I would have to just use the wee charity shop, the Edinburgh Sick Kids charity shop, for food. I couldn't get any hot food because you couldn't get near the canteen. There
was just no prospect of you being able to access the canteen?
No.
There was only stairs?
Yeah, there was no other way to get to it.
So what were your options in terms of going to get food?
A roll or hot noodles, if you could get the nurse to do it for you. And I mean, that was only hot food or a soup, because there was just nothing else. I mean, the shop was just literally a tiny wee shop that just sold the odd sandwich and wasn't set up for food itself. It was just the odd bit of thing here and there available.
And I think you indicate in your statement as well that, again, the nurses would sometimes help you out.
Oh, I mean, a lot of the time, if there wasn't food left over on the ward rounds, we would make sure the parents were offered it. So you got hot food that way. But regards to the canteen, there was just not a chance I was getting near the canteen.
And did you experience any other challenges in terms of accessibility within the hospital, thinking about shower facilities, bathroom facilities?
Yeah, I couldn't get a shower. I mean, there was one disabled toilet that was out the ward. You had to. It was like a public disabled toilet, so it was everybody was using it, and I'd have to use that to get washed in the morning. I mean, I'd take in wet wipes and that, and just get myself freshened in the morning there, because I had no washing facilities at all. It was just a toilet with a sink, so I would use that sink just to get my teeth brushed and freshen up a bit when I was staying with Charlie. But other than that, I mean, Kirsty, if she was in staying, she had PJ lofts, so you could go up there and get washed and showered and changed. But me being in a wheelchair, there was no chance of getting near that, so it was all upstairs.
What is PJ's loft, Mr. Bisset?
It's a charity. It's basically a big room for parents to sleep over. So it's got wash facilities and everything for the parents there, and it's used by not just one ward. It's for the hospital. So it was all there, which was good if you're able-bodied. You could sleep over there, and you could get washed there and freshen up. So that was there for every other parent. But then it was limited to numbers as well. So I think there's a few wards in there and a few kids in there, so it's not exactly the biggest space.
And are you indicating that PJ's loft was accessible only by stairs?
Yeah, stairs
only,
no lift or nothing. No. you could get the lift to the top floor of the hospital, but then it was like the PG's loft is what it says. It was in the loft. It was an attic, so it was only accessible by stairs.
I think you mentioned in your statement there's also a Click Sergeant facility in Edinburgh. Where's that located?
That's located over by the new hospital. It was just a new build. So it's now Young Lives versus Cancer, but it was Click Sergeant at the time. Charity. They had built the house over at the new Royal Infirmary, thinking that that hospital would have been opened by that point. So for a long time, I had got a room at the Click Sergeant, so I could go back. So we'd take it in turns, me and Kirsty, at staying over. So Kirsty would stay over for a few days, and then I would use the Click Sergeant house, just go in and visit and go back, and then we'd swap over so Kirsty could get some rest and some sleep at the Click Sergeant, and I would come in and stay. So it was, I can't remember the address yet, but it's just opposite the new Royal Infirmary, and it was built thinking that the hospital would have moved over by then. So I had a room there, but they supplied a taxi for me every morning and evening so I could get back and forward to the hospital as well.
Mr. Bisset, are you indicating that by the time that you and your daughter are using the old sick kids hospital, so this is early January 2019,
yeah,
the Click Sergeant facility at that point is located over at the new hospital
they did
site?
have one at the old hospital, but they'd closed that down and had moved to a brand new build.
That's very helpful, thank you. I'd like to ask you now a couple of questions about the staff on ward 2.
Yeah.
Did you form an impression about how the staff found the ward?
Aye, they were desperate to move.
And why was that?
To move. Just no space. I mean, they would moan and complain about the space, and it was tight. I mean, they had one treatment room. Now, if you've got 6 kids staying in rooms and you've got the daycare beds all full, you've only got one treatment room. A lot of the treatment was done at the daycare, was done in the beds, and few everybody else on the ward because they didn't have any other place to do it. So if you had one of the rooms and you were an inpatient, you could kind of close the curtains off, but the staff were desperate for it to move. Well, they had been told they were moving, and then it was put back, and then they were getting a bit sick, fed up, thinking, moving, we're not moving, we're moving, we're not moving. So every one of them was desperate to just a new building and a new start.
And I think you've indicated there that one of the challenges the staff faced was just the space on the ward. So the rooms were restricted, the ward was restricted in space. I think you say something in your statement about there being limited space for drip stands to be set up in the room.
Yeah, I am. You were fighting your space all the time. I mean, literally, the rooms, as much as I said, they're for inpatients. I mean, it was a bed, a telly up on the wall, your bathroom door. There was no cupboard space or nothing. There was nothing. I mean, some of the rooms were literally just had a bed and a tiny wee bit for the nurses to get to the side of the bed to give the treatment, so they didn't have much room to manoeuvre in the rooms themselves. If there was 2 nurses in the room, it was overcrowded. Okay. In some of them.
I think you say in your statement that I think there's some concern about the age of the equipment.
Yeah, it was just all old, and even their storage room was old. I mean, it was an old building. The woodwork in everything was old. Everything in the room was old, and the drip stands were constantly playing up. I mean, it was a fight over who got the drip stands because there were constant alarms going, and that's what they say. It's just all old equipment. Alarms were going off constantly. That's all you would hear in that ward was alarms going off on all the drip stands.
Were the staff optimistic that when the move to the new site came?
Well, we were actually in there the day that they were moving. Well, they were meant to be moving, and it was called off at the last minute. So they had been optimistic because everyone was packed up in boxes. The hospital was getting there. It was looking very empty. Charlie had been in, and she was in for treatment, and she had signed her name on the wall like the rest of the kids had done. And like I say, everyone was packed up and ready to go, and that's when it was called off at the last minute.
I was going to ask a couple of questions about what you knew about the move, Mr. Bisset, so I might just do that now if that's okay with you. So you've indicated that Charlie was in the hospital
the day that
that would be the 9th of July.
Yeah. She was in picking up meds, I think it was we were in for. So it wasn't in for treatment, but we were in the ward to pick up meds before. So
you were in the ward on the run up to the scheduled move date, which I think was the 9th of July. Okay. And do you recall how you found out the move was delayed
One of the nurses told us.
on the ward?
Yeah. And she had said, have you heard the news? Well, we hadn't had the radio on, and she was like, have you heard the news? Like, no, well, we're not moving. I said, everything had been packed. This was like the last minute.
And was she able to give you any more explanation?
No, she never said why. They just said that it had been called off at the last minute. And they didn't know when they'd be moving.
Did you experience any impact from the delayed move? I know you've indicated that your care moved over, Charlie's care moved over to Glasgow shortly after that, but was there any immediate impact for you
No,
then?
not really. Nothing specific. Just that you could see the staff were a bit upsetting. But no, it didn't really impact us as such because we were, like you say, into the Glasgow side of things by then. So.
Was there any formal communication about it, about the delayed move?
No, no.
No, so there's no letters or written communication?
No,
or anything
nothing
like
to the parents or that, no.
Just before we close off the Edinburgh chapter of your evidence, Mr. Bisset, I'd just like to ask you some questions about your overall impressions of the old Edinburgh hospital.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could tell us how you would assess it as a facility for your daughter to have her treatment.
As in the building itself, no the staff?
Yeah, the building and the ward.
Not fit for purpose.
And what was the reason for that?
Just it being old. Just being in there and I think it was because of the time of year that we were there and it being that cold and it was constantly cold. Even out with the room, the ward itself would be cold because it was all windows down one side of the wall so you could feel the draft coming in constantly. And it was tired. The building was tired.
I think one thing that you said earlier in your evidence was that you felt it was coming to the end of its life, really.
Aye, considering the amount of people that go through the hospital, it wasn't big enough. There was no car parking facilities. The actual facilities in the building itself weren't suitable for the amount of people that were coming and going every day. I mean, you could see it was tired. The walls were, the lift, even the lift. The elevator was the slowest elevator I've ever found in Scotland. I think that has to be the slowest elevator ever. And it was just because it was just old and tired and overused.
I think that feeds into my next question for you, Mr. Bisset, which was how would you assess it as a facility for families?
Poor. It wasn't big enough for families. It was, I mean, like I said, because we had room 6, we've got quite a big family. So room 6 was ideal for us because it was plenty of room, but there was no room for visitors in that. You'd only have 1 or 2 at a push at a time visiting if Charlie was on the ward because it wasn't big enough to fit them in the rooms. So for families, it was poor. Not just that ward, the hospital itself, it's no big.
And how would you assess it as a facility for you personally?
Being in a wheelchair, it was very difficult. Very difficult. Even the wheelchair ramps were steep and old, and the ones outside, it was cobbled streets outside, so cobbled streets aren't the easiest in a wheelchair. You almost tip out a few times, just your front wheel catches a cobble wrong, and then you're almost at your chair. So in that regards, outside it wasn't fit for it, and inside it was poor as well. 1 disabled toilet for the whole hospital. So bearing in mind that not just adults, there's lots of children in the hospital in the wheelchairs as well. So to have 1 disabled toilet was poor as it was.
So just so that I'm clear on that, there was only 1 disabled toilet for the
one in that
hospital?
part of the hospital, yeah. There was 1 further. I think there was only 2 in total. I only found 2, but 1 in the main hospital building at the main front entrance itself. There's 1 toilet.
Thank you, Mr. Bisset. We will touch on the experience at Edinburgh again later on in your evidence, but for now, what I'd like to do is move on to think about your daughter's experience in Glasgow.
Yeah.
And I understand, as you've indicated earlier, that began with appointments in the Queen Elizabeth on the 10th and 11th of June 2019.
Yeah, that's right, aye.
Could you begin by explaining why your daughter had to come to Glasgow at all?
She needed a bone marrow transplant, and Glasgow Queen Elizabeth's the transplant Hospital for Scotland. Now, it depended on availability when Charlie was needing the transplant. If it was Glasgow, it could have been Newcastle, because it's the next closest to where we are for a transplant. So she could have been going to Newcastle Hospital, but there was availability came up at the time that Charlie and the donor was ready, was Glasgow was set to go ahead. So.
Okay. And when your daughter attended the appointments on the 10th and 11th of June, was she an inpatient then?
No, outpatient. Attended on the 10th and then went back in on the 11th.
And what ward did she attend?
Ward 6A, and in the, it was like the outpatient clinic, which is on the bottom main atrium of the Children's Hospital. So it was the bottom floor on the main hospital. So
when you were attending Ward 6A, was this Ward 6A within the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, or was this Ward 6A the children's unit having been moved down to the Children's Hospital?
No, it was in the main Queen Elizabeth 6A.
In the main Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Ward 6A?
Yeah.
So you had to go up 6 floors or whatever to get there. And I think you indicated that your daughter was also in the Beatson Hospital during that.
Yeah, she went over for her meet the team and everyone for the radiotherapies.
Yeah. And you've explained that they took her through what would happen and set her up for that to try and allay any fear of her.
I mean, she was to take in her favourite CD, and so they would play her music and that while she was in getting her radiotherapy. So it was all just to put her at ease before she went up in July.
And when you were in the Queen Elizabeth on Ward 6A, did you have a discussion with your daughter's consultant at that time about
Yeah, we met Professor Gibson.
And what did Professor Gibson say about the transplant treatment that was coming?
That first week would be full body radiotherapy twice a day at the Beatson, as well as more chemotherapy for the first 10 days before the transplant as well. So it was I think it was 8 sessions of radiotherapy she'd have to get. So it was 2 sessions a day at the Beatson for 4 days, and then 10 days intense chemo before the actual transplant happened itself. And
did Professor Gibson give you any indication about how long the treatment would take, all going well?
All going well. They hoped that she would be in and out of the hospital 4 to 6 weeks. The actual transplant itself is over in a matter of minutes. So it's just the treatment beforehand and the after effects, really.
Now, you indicate in your statement, Mr. Bisset, that something happened, I think, only a day after these appointments.
Yeah, Charlie took ill. She dropped really quick. She was fine 1 minute, feeling fine, and then the next she started shivering, she felt sick. And when Charlie was first diagnosed, you get given a digital thermometer. Every child get given the same make so that the hospitals know they're reliable. And because Charlie had literally just dropped so quick, we'd done a temperature check and she'd spiked. Now, any temperature over 37.8 they regarded as a spike, and then you'd have to phone the hospital. So we were actually on a family holiday at Portobello. It was one of the cancer charities. We'd got a free few days so we were there when she took ill. So we phoned Edinburgh Sick Kids saying, look, Charlie's no feeling well. She spiked the temperature, so we had to bring her in. So she ended up back in hospital the day after being at Glasgow. She ended up back in Edinburgh Sick Kids, and she was admitted with temperatures and sickness and diarrhoea and no feeling well. So
was that on the 12th of June she was admitted? So
yeah.
She had her temperature, so she'd been in the Queen Elizabeth on the 10th and 11th of June?
Yeah, and then on the 12th she just dropped.
So she had a temperature spike?
Yep. And
we've heard quite a lot of evidence about temperature spikes, as I'm sure you know, but she had her temperature spike on the 12th of June?
Yeah, she was 38.4 at one point, so just take her straight in. So
she was taken to the Old Edinburgh Hospital at that point. And was she admitted as an inpatient?
Yes.
Then? And did they take any blood tests from her?
They took blood and stool samples, and they always take blood samples and stool samples any time where they treat with cancer with the kids. That if they spike a temperature, they take everything. They take your blood, stool samples, and then they put you straight on antibiotics before they've got the results back. It's just how it's done, because any infection can be serious.
Were you given any explanation for the
None.
possible cause of the temperature
None.
spike? Were you told it was an infection?
Yeah, I can't remember what they called it. They never really said much about it. And then they mentioned adenovirus as well, that in the stool sample, adenovirus had came back in one of the stool samples.
Is this thinking about the infection in June 2019?
Oh, nearly in June, no, we never got a name. It was only recently when I got the letter from the inquiry.
We'll come on to that, Mr. Bisset. So in June, so this, thinking about the 12th of June 2019, was there any indication given for of a reason for the temperature spike?
Oh, no.
No,
No.
nothing at all. No. And your daughter was admitted for a few days at that time?
7 days.
7. Okay. And was she given antibiotics?
Yeah. Once you start the antibiotics, they'll not let you go home again until you've been 48 hours without a spike in temperature. So she was 4 or 5 days in before she stopped spiking her temperature.
And for anyone following the statement, sorry, I should have said before, we're now at around about paragraph 104. So you've indicated no explanation was given for the temperature spike at that time.
No.
Did you subsequently find out a reason for the temperature spike and the admission in
Since
June?
the inquiry, yeah, we got the letter saying that it was forgive me, I can't mind the name.
Candida pseudomonas, is that the one?
That's the one.
I'm sure I've not got it right, don't worry. And when you say the letter, who was the letter from?
The hospital inquiry, I can't remember the name.
So the case note review?
Yeah, the case note review. It came back then that Charlie had contracted, well, that she could have contracted it at Glasgow at the time.
And when did you receive that letter? Roughly, don't need an exact date. This year?
Yeah.
This year, okay.
April, May, that sound about right?
Yep.
Early in the year anyway.
In the spring of this year?
Yeah.
And are you indicating that that letter said that in June 2013, Charlie had had an infection called Candida pseudomonas?
Yes.
Okay. And did it say anything about the possible source of that infection?
No.
No. It didn't draw any links to either hospital?
No. They couldn't say one way or another, it said on the letter. But she hadn't been in Edinburgh Hospital.
Because she'd been in the Glasgow Hospital in the
then
Queen Elizabeth on the 10th and 11th of June as an outpatient.
Yeah.
Is that right? And we will come back more to the case note review correspondence and other events later on in your evidence, Mr. Bisset. Now, just thinking about when your daughter was admitted to the Edinburgh Hospital on 13th June, you received no communication at Edinburgh about the name of this infection at the time?
No.
No. But she was diagnosed in Edinburgh?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you happen to know if there was any communication between Edinburgh and Glasgow?
Edinburgh, Glasgow keep in regular contact.
Okay.
If she's treated at Edinburgh, they consult with Glasgow. Because Glasgow's the main transplant centre, everything that happens at Edinburgh has to be communicated to Glasgow's team.
Do you know if there was any communication about this temperature spike or infection event?
I couldn't tell you if there was or not.
Okay.
I'd assume so, going by the fact that everything else has to go through Glasgow. So.
And thinking back again to June 2019, Mr. Bisset, were you aware of any concerns at all about the environment in Glasgow?
No, not at all.
No.
No.
Mr. Bisset, what I'd like to do now is move on to the next phase of your daughter's treatment.
Yeah.
So we're coming on to the bone marrow transplant. And you say in your statement she was admitted to Ward 4B in the Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah.
On the 21st July 2019.
That's right, yeah. Sunday evening.
And what was the purpose of her admission at that time?
At that time, it was for preparation for the bone marrow transplant. So our full body radiotherapy began on the Monday morning. Our first appointment at Beatson was Monday. We had to be there on the Sunday evening to start the 10 days treatment for the transplant.
And was she receiving chemotherapy at the same time as this?
Chemo in the ward, as well as going in and back and forward to the Beatson for 4 days.
I think you indicate in your statement it was quite intense chemotherapy she was receiving at this time.
Yep. And the full body radiotherapy wiped her out as well.
And did you indicate, Mr Bisset, that your daughter was going back and forward to the Beatson twice a day for 4 days?
Yeah. Once in the morning, once in the afternoon for 4 days.
Mr Bisset, how was your daughter transported to and from the Beatson?
A taxi.
A black cab?
No, it was the normal cars with the Glasgow plates on them.
So like a private cab?
Yeah, but they weren't private. I mean, one of them was disgusting. They hadn't been cleaned. But bearing in mind, these kids are in for a transplant with no immune system. They feel the radiotherapy is to wipe out their immune systems completely. Chemotherapy weakens your immune system anyway. Now, I get they have to go to the Beatson because that's where all the radiotherapy equipment is, but surely it makes more sense to have a private hospital vehicle rather than a taxi that everybody's using. To this day, I never understood it. I never understand why they would use a car. I mean, they're that strict on the ward about if I was coming in, I had to wash my wheelchair down with alcohol wipes from top to bottom. I had to remove my jacket, remove my trainers before I was allowed into the room to see Charlie. Yet she could leave and go back and forward to the Beatson in the back of a taxi that hadn't been cleaned.
So you're indicating, Mr Bisset, that the taxis that were used are just the taxis that anybody in Glasgow could be using?
You could flag it down and use it, and then the next thing it's got a call to come to the hospital to take somebody to the Beatson.
And I think you're indicating now that you had some concern about that process.
Aye.
And was your concern related to infection risk?
Yeah, because she's got no immune system. That's the whole point of the radiotherapy, is to wipe them, to take the body back to zero, basically, so that it gives the transplant more chance of working. So Charlie's immune system, or bone marrow, everyone has to be wiped to zero for the transplant to be in a better position to work, to get rid of the leukemia. So you're at a high risk for infection, and yet they're using a public vehicle.
Potentially 4 public vehicles a day?
Well, 8 in total, because it wasn't the same one in the afternoon as you got in the morning either.
So you'd have one there and back in the morning, one there and back in the afternoon?
Yep.
Each of
so
those
that's
days.
8 different vehicles. And all you got was a registration plate to go out, and that was, you found the car out the front, and that was your transport back and forward.
Mr Bisset, I'd like to pause there and ask you a few questions about Ward 4B and its facilities, if that's okay. I understand your daughter spent quite a lot of time on Ward 4B and also in the paediatric intensive care unit, which we'll come on to. So thinking now about Ward 4B. To your understanding, what type of ward is Ward 4B?
Transplant ward.
Transplant ward.
Adult and child.
For adults and children.
Yeah.
Could you describe your daughter's room on Ward 4B?
First room.
Yeah.
It was in the far bottom right-hand corner, and it was, you were into the room, you had the wash-hand basin on the left-hand side that the nurses and the doctors used. Then you had your bed right in the centre on the left-hand wall, got the equipment round it, and your parents' bed was in the far corner, and on the right-hand side, on the right-hand side as you went in, there's a disabled bathroom. So there was a wheelchair accessible bathroom in that room that Charlie was in.
Do you recall any specialised ventilation arrangements for these rooms?
No, we did have a air purifier in the room, but then they said that they didn't want to use that, and then they were using it, and then they weren't using it, but there was an air, looked like a big cube sitting in the middle of the room.
Are you indicating that on Ward 4B there's an air purifier within your daughter's bedroom?
Yep.
Is that right?
Yep.
A mobile unit of some kind?
Yeah, a big white pillar.
And just to clarify, Mr Bisset, am I right in understanding this is a single room? There's no lobby room or anything before you go into it? This is a single bedroom, just with one set of doors to the corridor?
Yeah.
And I think you've touched on this already, Mr Bisset, but were there special cleanliness protocols for going in and out of Ward 4B or going in and out of the room?
Yeah, you couldn't wear any outdoor clothing, so you had to remove your jacket. I had to remove my shoe from my foot before I went in, and I had to, as I said, I had to wipe my wheelchair down because I had been staying at the Glasgow Click Sergeant House at this point, which is across the road from the hospital. So because I'm going in and out the room, I would have to wipe my chair completely down from top to bottom, wash my hands thoroughly in that, and remove outdoor shoes and jackets before entering the room.
And so were your belongings left outside the room,
Yeah.
somewhere in the
Yep.
corridor? Okay. And am I right in thinking that this is because a sterile environment is needed, because as you've indicated already, your daughter was immune suppressed at this time?
Yes.
Were there facilities on ward 4B for parents to stay overnight?
No. Well, a fold-out bed, so one parent could stay, yeah.
But it was a fold-out bed in the sense of being a camp bed type.
Yeah, a bit better than the old-fashioned ones, but it was just a fold-out bed.
Okay. It was a temporary arrangement. It wasn't a pull-down bed.
No, it wasn't a pull-down. No, it was just a fold-away bed.
And I think you've indicated already that these rooms at least were slightly more accessible to you as a wheelchair user.
Yeah,
is that right?
far easier to manoeuvre in. Yeah.
Were the rooms on ward? I think you've indicated already your daughter was in more than one room on ward 4B, which we will come on to. But are you indicating that the rooms on ward 4B are all of a similar nature, or are they different?
No, they can be different sizes as well.
And did that present any challenges for you?
One of them did, yeah. One of them was really tight for space.
Mr. Bisset, do you recall if there were any facilities on ward 4B for children?
No.
No.
Nothing.
No playroom?
No, because she wasn't allowed. Once Charlie went into a room on that Sunday night, the only time she left was to go to the beach, and apart from that, she wasn't allowed to leave her room. So they had children's entertainment come in, but they couldn't come into Charlie's room. They would just entertain her through a window.
Okay.
So nobody was allowed in other than myself and my wife, and Charlie wasn't allowed to leave her room.
And was there a television in that room?
Yeah.
Did it work?
Now and again.
And what about any facilities for parents on that ward?
We never ever got shown anything on that ward. I mean, there was a room as we came in at the top of the ward that obviously for adults, but there was no tea facilities or that. That's just where my mum and that would pop up when they were in the area to visit. Although they couldn't come and see Charlie, they would pop in to see how we were doing. But at that point, no, there was no we had never been shown any facilities.
I think you indicate in your statement, and this is around about paragraph 38, you don't need to look it up, Mr. Bisset, that you felt there was a lack of facilities because it was an adult ward designed for adults.
Yeah. It was like the children were an afterthought. I mean, we're in the adult hospital, and there was only 3 or 4 rooms at the end of the ward that were children, the rest were all adult. So there was no children's facilities at all.
It didn't feel to you as though it had been designed for children in any way?
Nothing. Even the walls, when you go into the children's hospital and that's all painted and decorated for children. That wasn't. The transplant ward rooms were just plain.
And Mr. Bisset, you've already mentioned the Click Sergeant facility in Glasgow. Could you explain what the accommodation arrangements were for you and your wife when you were staying with your daughter in Glasgow?
We had one room in Glasgow which had a double bed and a single bed and a pull-out bed. But that was, and you had your own bathroom.
Sorry, Mr. Bisset, is this in the Click Sergeant facility? Yeah, thank you.
You've got that, and that's each family's room. You got a double bed, a single bed, and a pull-out single bed. Your own bathroom, and then it's a shared kitchen facilities and shared washing machines and tumble dryers. Because your clothing that Charlie and that were wearing in the ward, it would have to be sealed in specific bags, coloured bags, to be taken back to the Click Sergeant house and washed in special washing machines. And you had to label it that it was your stuff in there so that there was no cross-contamination from another room or another child. So there was a room that had 8 washing machines and 8 tumble dryers in it. You had 2 shared kitchens and 2 shared living room, and there was a teenage cancer kids room set up. I mean, it was all set up for families. It was a really nice house. It was a newly built one as well. So
I think you indicate in your statement, and this is at paragraph 7, that Click Sergeant didn't just provide accommodation for families, there were other services and facilities they provided. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
They do a lot to help, not just the child. Charlie was always getting, when we were in Edinburgh, Callum was the Click Sergeant social worker, was always getting Charlie vouchers to spend and build a beer. But with everything that was going on in Glasgow, they kind of looked after the older children more than they did Charlie. So the older children were getting shopping vouchers and cinema vouchers and eat out vouchers. And like you say, the rooms, the house itself had a teenage playroom, so it had the Xbox, the PlayStation, loads of musical instruments, and so it was geared up for the rest of the family, not just the child that was going through the treatment. So they looked after you that way, as well as looking after. And they have social workers, but no social workers would know it in the real sense. I mean, the social workers were there to help talk with the families. I mean, my kids are older than Charlie, so Charlie was the youngest, so they didn't open up and deal with it properly, everything that went on, so they kind of helped that way. And they look after the families, is what I'm trying to say. It's not just specifically the child, it's the whole family gets looked after.
I think you indicate in your statement that they provide a wide range of support for the families.
Yep.
Mr. Bisset, before we move on to events involving your daughter's treatment and illness in August 2019, I want to just pause there and ask you a few questions about preventative medication, which you mentioned in your statement. Now, as far as you were aware, was your daughter on any preventative medications when she was admitted to the Glasgow hospital? When
she started her treatment, they started them on antibiotics. I can't mind the names of them all specifically, but they're because she's in the middle of getting her immunosuppressed, so she's getting her immune system stripped back and taken away, that they put them on antibiotics as such to prevent rather than wait until an infection takes hold. So you just get told that they'll require this treatment, they'll require this, we'll give them this on this day. You don't actually get told what each one's specifically for, just that this is a treatment plan going forward from now. And this is why we give it, because she's got no immune system and we don't want to risk catching an infection, so we'll give her the antibiotics. But since those first few days in June and getting told this is a treatment plan, I've since found out that she was given drugs that wasn't part of the treatment plan. That if you had had the transplant, say, in Newcastle, like we had originally been told it could be Newcastle, Glasgow, she wouldn't be taking this. One of them specifically was posaconazole. She wouldn't be taking that in Newcastle. And it since came out that it was because of the Glasgow hospital that she was taking posaconazole. We were told that this was part of, same as at the beginning when she was first diagnosed, that this is what treatment's given to every child at the time. And as parents, you just take the hospital's, the doctor's word for it, that you're given these drugs and these treatments because that's what's needed. Not until afterwards that you find out it's no part of the treatment plan and it wasn't needed at the time. Well, it was, but not for what we were led to believe it was needed for.
Mr. Bisset, I'd like to explore some of the detail around that with you, if that's okay. As far as you recall, was your daughter on any preventative medications while she was in Edinburgh?
Nah. No regular on that. She was only given antibiotics and preventative medicines if she became ill with a temperature, or you were never given antibiotics for the sake of giving antibiotics. You were only ever given them if the child showed a temperature. The minute they spiked a temperature, antibiotics would begin, but you weren't given them on a regular basis. It was only if they became ill or showed a temperature or something showed up in the blood samples from the time, then they would be given it. But no, can't say that, no, they were given this the whole time.
And do you recall when your daughter was placed on these, when she moved over to Glasgow? Would it have been in June when she had her first appointment?
No,
there?
July.
In July. Okay.
July. From the 22nd it all began.
22nd of July?
Yeah, she was admitted the 21st and then the treatment actually began on Monday the 22nd of July.
And did you have a discussion with your daughter's consultant about the antibiotics at that time? No.
No. You've no reason to ask them why they're getting this or that. You're just taking it on face value that what they're telling you is the truth, and they're taking it because it's part of the treatment plan.
I think you've indicated you were told that these medications were being given as part of the treatment plan.
Yeah,
so that there was a discussion around that.
You weren't told specifically what each one was for, but it was just told that this is how it goes. This is what happens when you're on this stage of the treatment.
And I think you've indicated that one of these medications was called posaconazole, if I've got that right. Okay, and was it indicated to you that posaconazole was part of the treatment plan?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you have any concerns about these medications at the time?
Not at the time, no.
No. Did there come a point where you had some concerns about them?
When it was all coming out in the media about the hospital itself and speaking to other parents in the Click Sergeant house, you hear some of the stories and that you start Googling it yourself and what these medications for. And but at the time, no, not at the time, but then when it started coming out in the media about the hospital environment and infections, and I mean, you send your kid to hospital to get better, and you trust a doctor and what they're telling you. So if a doctor's telling you need this as part of the treatment plan, you've no reason to doubt the doctor's telling you the truth or why they're giving it. You're trusting that doctor that that's what's happening.
I think you indicate in your statement, Mr. Bisset, and I think this is at paragraph 68. It might be worth you just having a very quick look at that. We don't need to bring it up. It's just have a quick look at it if you've got it in front of you. Paragraph 68, which should be on page 31 of the bundle.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah, so I think you indicate there that at one point you challenged one of your daughter's doctors about the medication. Why did you feel the need to challenge one of the doctors about it?
Because I had Googled what posaconazole and the side effects, and because it was on the national news. You were seeing stuff on the national news at the time, and every time you bought a newspaper at the time there was something. You came into the hospital and there was TV crews standing outside the hospital, so you were beginning to be made aware of what was going on and what was being said. So therefore it feeds back into, well, wait a minute. My daughter, a part of this, is she getting this medication and stuff that she shouldn't be getting? So that's only because what was coming out on the news at night and everything that you start to think, well, I need to challenge this and find out more.
What was the response from the doctor?
That was
when
part
you
of the
were
treatment
challenged?
plan.
Part of the treatment plan?
Yep.
I think you say, Mr. Bisset, it's about halfway down that paragraph.
Yeah, Dr.
68. You say, when I challenged them, saying it wasn't part of the plan, they kept saying it is for this hospital and that's how we do it.
Yep.
Is that right? Is that what
Yep.
you were told?
Yep, Dr. Pinto.
And Mr. Bisset, did you have any concerns about side effects of these medications on your
Yes,
daughter?
some of the side effects, especially posaconazole, is quite serious.
What did you understand the side effects to be?
That it could seriously harm them. It can lose their... I know one child that lost her hearing through the treatment. I mean, it's not a drug that even nurses treat lightly. I know from talking to nurses and that pharmacists will check with their nurse to make sure they really should be getting this drug at the time. And this isn't just the Glasgow hospital. I've spoke to nurses that I know that have said to me in the past that pharmacists will always check with their nurse before prescribing this because it's a serious drug to be given with serious side effects.
So as you understand it, it was a drug to be taken seriously?
Yeah. But again, the doctors are telling you that it's part of the treatment, so you have to go along with it. It's not like I can challenge and say, well, wait a minute, because I don't know nothing. I'm just a parent that's worried about a child, but at the same time, I don't know if it's part of the treatment or not, so I'm just relying on both these doctors that I said in my statement, telling me and they're speaking the truth. Do
you recall when that discussion was with the doctors, when you had the awareness to challenge them?
It must have been end of July, beginning of August, because that's when she started all the treatment. So it had to be the first week of the treatment, so the last week in July.
And is that when things had started to come out in the news that caused you to be concerned?
Yeah, the odd bit here and there, aye.
And were you given any indication, other than that's how we do it, about why?
No. Nobody ever said why.
Mr. Bisset, I'm going to move on now and ask you about events in August 2019. I'm going to start by asking you about your daughter's bone marrow transplant.
Yeah.
Okay. You've told us your daughter was admitted to Ward 4B to be prepared for the transplant. She had an amount of treatment to go through before that. When did she have her actual transplant?
2nd of August 2019.
And did she have it on Ward 4B?
Yeah.
What did it involve?
Nothing. It really is. You build it up and build it up. I mean, I'm laughing now, but you build it up that it's this big thing. And then they come in with a wee trolley where it just looks like blood. It looks like a bit more clear than blood, but it's just a wee bag. And the nurse at the time, Yvonne, it was, she does the transplants. And she says, every parent's the same. They build it up in your heads and you build it up to be this big thing, and then it literally is just like getting a blood transfusion. You just hook it up, feed it into Charlie, and that's it. That's it. It's that massive, but that small at the same time. It's a massive event, but such a small. You think it's going to be a lot bigger than it actually is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, Mr. Bisset. I think you indicate in your statement that your daughter was kept in isolation in her room on Ward 4B after receiving the transplant.
Aye.
And does that mean she didn't come out of her room at all?
Not out of her room at all.
In your statement, you indicate that your daughter began to deteriorate, I think around about the 10th of August 2019.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Can you tell us what happened?
Through that week, she started becoming more tired. At the beginning, it was just tiredness. Now we just put it down to the transplant, and it's maybe just the new bone marrow taking over. And then towards the end of that week, her breathing started to become more and more laboured. And it was the Saturday evening, me and Charlie, every Saturday we watch Casualty together. 7-year-old, she loves Casualty, so we sit and watch that. Well, she was in her bed in the room in 4B, and we're watching Casualty, and I'm lying in the bed beside her, and she actually sounded like she had ran a marathon. Her breathing had got that bad on the Saturday night. It really did sound like she was struggling to breathe, and she was really panting. So they turned up the oxygen flow in her room the Saturday night, and then on the Sunday morning, it was the same. She was really laboured in her breathing. Now, she had been sleeping all night. She'd fell asleep. It was 10 o'clock Saturday night, and it was 10 o'clock the Sunday morning when she really started to wake up, and she had just woke up, and it sounded like she was running. The breathing, so they came in, and at this point they put her up to 3 litres of oxygen in the room, which is what they say is the highest that it should be at. So at this point they got intensive care doctor to come up and have a look at Charlie. Well, it was a specialist to come and see her. And they were quite concerned at that point. So they were away to make arrangements for her to be moved. So it was later on the Sunday afternoon, she ended up being moved down to paediatric intensive care, where they could monitor more closely on how much oxygen she was needing. Because she deteriorated from Saturday night to Sunday so quick. And even throughout the Sunday, my wife hadn't been well, so she came in, and then on the Sunday night, my wife stayed in intensive care with her all night. And on Monday morning, they actually pulled us both in and said that her breathing's that bad that we're going to have to talk to her and tell her that we're putting her asleep to put a cannula in her hand, but they're putting her onto a ventilator. So from the Saturday to the Monday morning, she had deteriorated that much that she was on high flow oxygen. It wasn't working. She felt like she was running a marathon. And then the Monday morning first thing, that was they put her out, put her onto a ventilator to keep her going because her breathing was that bad.
Mr. Bisset, were these events, this rapid deterioration, around about the 18th of August?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think just to cover some of the detail of that, you've indicated that your daughter was seen by the paediatric intensive care doctors, who I think came up to Ward 4B.
Yeah,
that's right? And they decided, following her deterioration, that they were going to transfer her over to the paediatric intensive care unit. Can I ask you a couple of questions now about that transfer from Ward 4B to the paediatric intensive care unit? To your understanding, where is the PICU situated relative to Ward 4B?
In the Children's Hospital.
So is that in a separate building?
Yeah, but you go through a corridor to connect them, but it's the Children's Hospital rather than the main adult hospital.
And what do you recall about what that transfer from Ward 4B to the PICU involved?
Can't mind too much. It was quite quick.
Okay, so was it quite a smooth process?
Yeah.
I think you've indicated that shortly after being taken to the PICU, your daughter was placed on a ventilator, is that right?
Yeah, and the following morning, yeah.
Yeah. Now, I understand your daughter was in the PICU for around about 8 weeks
Yeah, that's
in
right.
total, is that right? I'd like to walk through some of that
Yeah.
with you. And for those following the statement, we're around about paragraph 26. Now, your daughter had obviously had bone marrow transplant very recently. She was severely immune compromised. Was she given her own room in the PICU?
Yeah, yeah, she went straight into room 12 it was.
And I think you say in your statement that while your daughter was in the PICU, she was cared for mainly by staff from the PICU, but also her oncology doctors.
Yeah, the
checked in.
oncology doctors would come down every morning to see Charlie's situation, see how she was. But the main care was in
From the
was
PICU
on
doctors.
PICU staff. Yeah.
Okay. And when your daughter was first admitted to the PICU, so this is around about the 18th of August, did you have an understanding about what had caused your daughter to deteriorate?
No, not at all. At that point, no. When she first went in, we didn't know what had caused it. There was 2 or 3 things. At first, it was graft versus host disease. Then it was adenovirus. And then it came out that there was a fungal infection inside Charlie's blood. But other than that, no. They weren't sure of what caused it at that point.
Okay, so initially when you arrived, they had a few different hypotheses of what might be causing it, one of which was the adenovirus, one was graft versus host disease.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think you've just indicated you were also told that your daughter had a fungal infection at around about that time.
Yeah.
Were you told the name of the infection?
Not at the beginning, no.
No. And did you subsequently find out the name of the infection?
Yeah.
How did you find that out?
Through, now the nurses in intensive care, they work 12-hour shifts, so they work from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. And 8 o'clock at night, well, just before 8 o'clock, the night nurse would come in for the handover. And this happens in your room with the child, so the nurse would come in and they would, how's your day been? Or the Charlie's had this, that. And so it was 2 or 3 times we'd been told that there was a fungal infection as well as maybe graft versus host and adenovirus. And so anyway, one of the nurses was doing the handover and she had said to the other nurse, oh, and she's got aspergillus. Or that's how you pronounce it. And I said, what's
I'm unable to help on that one.
I said, what's aspergillus? I'd asked the nurse, I said, what's aspergillus? That's the first time I'd heard, oh, she's got aspergillus. And we would heard the adenovirus and maybe graft versus host, but then it was, she's got aspergillus. I says, what's aspergillus? Well, that's infection she's got. So that was the first time we had been told that she had aspergillus. That was only through the nurses doing the handover that I overheard it.
I'm going to come back, Mr. Bisset, to ask you about that event and communication about this infection more generally in just a moment.
Yeah.
My lord, I'm conscious that it's 1 o'clock. If we're able to sit on for another 10 minutes or so at the moment, I might be able to finish this chapter of evidence.
That would seem to make good sense. Let's sit on till about 1:15 or so.
I'm grateful, my lord.
Yep.
Mr. Bisset, in your statement, you indicate that your daughter's condition, I think, became worse again on around about the 22nd of August, 2019,
well,
is that?
I think it was the 20th was the first time that we were told to get the family in. So it was the next again day for being put on the ventilator was the first time that we were told to get the family up.
And when you say we're told to get the family up, what did you understand that to mean?
She wasn't going to make it through the night.
And so the first time that happened was around about the 20th of August, so just after she'd been placed on the ventilator?
Yeah, she'd only been on the ventilator a day or two when they were told to get the rest of the family up.
And what were you told about your daughter's condition at that time?
Just that it was becoming serious and there was not much more they could do apart from keep her comfortable at the time.
And I think you indicate in your statement there was another event, another similar event on the 22nd of August, 2019. Yeah. So what happened then? Was it a similar situation?
Same thing. She had just, her body had swelled right up. I mean, to look at her on the ventilator and her face, she would, I mean, my family came up and I had to say to my mum and dad, before you go in, that you'll not recognise her because she's swollen. It was her stomach was swollen, her hands were swollen, but her face more than anything, you could hardly see her eyes for the swelling in her face. I had to prepare them before they went in. So on the 22nd, it was becoming, Charlie didn't look like Charlie. She looked like a different child lying in the bed. It didn't look like my wee girl. And it really became clear that she was really ill and was running out of options. So again, we were told to get the family in. And at one point, we were actually discussing whether we should switch the machines off and let her go peacefully or what could be done. At this point, she had been moved from the ventilator to a oscillator ventilator, which is one that they turn her over and place her on her belly, and it shakes you, try and get the lungs back functioning, because there was just no, the ventilator was doing everything for Charlie. It had become that laboured that the ventilator was, if they had switched the machine off, they had to manually, Charlie was doing nothing for herself at that point, so they'd moved her onto an oscillator ventilator to try and shake the lungs back in, and this is when we were told to get the family in that it wasn't working. And they had discussed different options about an ECMO ventilator with Rome, specialists in Rome and somebody from Germany. But with Charlie's condition that she was in, they were told not to do that because it was more harm than it would be any good. So, and the chances if she went on ECMO, she wouldn't have come off of that one. So this is at the point that we were to get the family in and discuss what do we do now.
I think just picking up on some of what you've said there, Mr. Bisset, you indicate in your statement on the 28th of August 2019, I think there was a new treatment was tried at that point. I think you say it was T-cell treatment?
Yeah, toxic T-cells.
And what is that treatment used to treat?
Well, the best way to describe it is with everything that's going on now, with COVID, they were talking about it in the news a few months back about taking somebody's bloods that have had COVID to try and defeat somebody else that's maybe seriously ill in hospital. So what they do is they take the bit out of your blood that treat a certain illness. So in Charlie's case, it was adenovirus at the time that was running amok with Charlie's condition. So what they wanted to do with the toxic T cells was get somebody that had adenovirus but had beaten it, and then they supersize the cells in the blood that have beaten that disease, and they make them bigger and stronger, and then they transfer it into the patient that's ill with it, and it fights it better. So with Charlie, that was the adenovirus, toxic T cells, make them super strength and put them into Charlie to fight it.
I think you indicate it was a hospital in Germany assisted with that.
Yeah, that's who done it, and they sent it.
And so just to be...
They had to get permission for it to be imported into the country and everything, and it wasn't just a straightforward, can we have that, we'll do it tomorrow. It was a sort of a sit and wait and hope that everything was allowed to happen. And
so at this point, Mr. Bisset, I think you're indicating that certainly one of the main concerns was the adenovirus.
Yeah, that was one of the conditions that they were worried about with Charlie.
And was this what caused Charlie to deteriorate at this point, or was it one of...
One of many, one of two or three.
Okay. And I think you also indicate on your statement that the day after that, so the day after Charlie received the T-cell treatment, she deteriorated again.
Yeah, we got a phone call.
Bleed on her lungs, is that right?
Yeah, we got a phone call early in the morning to say that we needed to get across to the hospital and get in as quick as possible. She had a massive bleed on her lungs. Now, they can't say if it was the toxic T-cell treatment that caused it. The chances are it could have been that because she had that the afternoon before, so you would assume that something that had happened had caused from that, but they couldn't say one way or another that's what caused it. But she had a massive bleed in her lungs, and her lungs were clogged up with blood and serious. I mean, at one point, actually, that was another time that we were told she's going to struggle to get through this. I think this was the third or fourth time that we'd been told to get the family in, and that we're looking at a worst case scenario.
You indicate in your statement that there were concerns at this time about the fungal infection as well that your daughter had had, is that right?
Yep.
That thought to be a possible cause of this?
Yeah, it had been found in the blood, which meant The first time that they found Aspergillus, they said that it could have been a contaminated sample, so they can't say for certain that Charlie's got Aspergillus, which that came from the lungs when they done a bowel, so they take suction out from in their lungs and out their throat and everything to check, and that's when the Aspergillus first showed up. And that's when they said it could have been a contaminated sample. We can't say one for another, so we'll just keep using. They kept chopping and changing antibiotics at this point because she had a fungal infection and it was trying to fight this fungal infection. And that's when the Aspergillus had showed up in the lungs, and that was a contaminated sample. But then when they done a blood test a couple of days later, the Aspergillus showed up in the blood. And for it to be in the blood meant it had to have been in the lungs at some point. So that meant the contaminated sample couldn't have been a contaminated sample, it had to have been there.
So if I understand you correctly, in August 2019, when your daughter's in PICU at this point, she's got certainly two things of concern that are going on: the adenovirus, which you've mentioned, and also this fungal infection, the Aspergillus.
Yeah.
And I think you indicate that in your statement, on the 1st of September 2019, this was when she was moved to the other type of ventilator.
Yeah.
Right? The oscillator ventilator, you said. And was that successful?
Nah.
No.
Nah. That's when they had the discussion with Rome and Germany about putting on the ECMO ventilator, because the oscillator hadn't worked. It hadn't made any improvement at all. Charlie just was still the same. So they switched her back instead of the ECMO, because Rome and Germany had said that she's in such a precarious condition that if you'd done that, she's probably not going to come off the ECMO ventilator. So they put her back onto the regular ventilator that she had been on, and that's when Dr. Chris Kitson, that's when we were having the discussion as a family. Got given a family room, and we were in PICU in the family room discussing if we switch the machines off, because she's at the point now that the doctors are telling us that there's nothing left they can do or try to save her. It was just about keeping her comfortable at that point. So, and Dr. Chris Kitson had came into the room and said, look, he was the one that had put her on the oscillator ventilator and it hadn't worked. So he came back in after I can't remember the doctor it was that had told us about, we're at the point that we can't. So Chris Kitson came into the room and said, look, we can't just stop, we have to. I was in tears thinking, look, she's been in pain, she's suffering, she's going through a hell of a lot now, just to keep her going. And he had promised me that, give me a few days of massive dose steroids, and he promised that if we don't see an improvement, then I'm agreeing with you that we are at the end of the road. And thankfully he came in and said all this at the time, because that's when it made her better and saved her.
And is Dr. Kitson one of the PICU
doctors? Yeah.
So he came along at this point and said, have a last throw of the dice here, and a massive dose of steroids.
It was a massive dose of steroids twice a day for a few days, just to see if Charlie responded. Because it wasn't just about her lungs responding, it was about Charlie responding, because at this point, as I said, the ventilators are doing all the work. Charlie wasn't doing anything at this point. She wasn't even trying to breathe herself when they turned the machine off and manually and that. There was nothing at that point. So his plan was a massive dose steroids to see if it would give her a boost. And it worked? It worked, aye. Yeah. Thankfully it worked.
Charlie turned a corner at that point and began to improve? She
started to make improvements slowly, and by surely every day you could just see that wee bit more improvement. They would take her off the ventilator and do it manually while they'd done the bowel suctions to clear her lungs, and you could see the bag moving itself, which was showing that Charlie was trying to breathe on her own. So the more that she started to improve, the less drugs that they would give her to stop. She was like, it's an induced coma, so she's sleeping, but they're controlling it. They're controlling how awake she could be by how much each drug that she gets. So at this point, because she was showing signs of making an effort, they started to wean her off the high dose drugs to keep her asleep. See if she would come round, and which day by day it was, well, not even day, by 2 or 3 days there was a massive difference.
I think you indicate in your statement that Charlie did have to stay in the PICU unit for some time after that.
Yeah. It was literally like she woke up I mean, if she had an itchy face, she couldn't scratch it, she couldn't lift her arms, the muscle wasted. She had been on a ventilator for 8 weeks at this point, so, well, 7 weeks, 7.5 weeks. So at this point, the muscle wastage and everything was, I mean, it was quite scary how much actually it deteriorates somebody in such a short space of time.
And do you recall when she was to be released from the PICU?
I can't mind the dates offhand, but they wanted
A few
to.
weeks.
Yeah, aye. They wanted to release it. It was October time, and they wanted to release her back to Ward 6. And I was adamant because everything that was coming out in the media then about she wasn't going to Ward 6. I refused to send her to Ward 6. So in the end, we had to wait another 2 or 3 days, and then she went back to Ward 4B, where she was for the transplant.
I'll come back, Mr. Bisset, to ask you about your reservations about Ward 6 shortly. But are you indicating that your daughter went from the PICU to Ward 4B?
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay. And what was your daughter's condition at that stage? I think you indicate in your statement this is around about the end of October 2019. What was her condition then?
She was awake, alert, but she really couldn't do much for herself. She would be on intense physio every day on the ward, twice or thrice a day, sometimes 3 times, because she physically couldn't do nothing for herself. She couldn't walk. She couldn't even sit up in bed without you having to support her and that. So it really was learning to use her body part, her arms and her legs. Everything had to be like she had to reteach her muscles how to work.
I think you indicate in your statement that your daughter had to have quite intense physiotherapy
Yeah.
to recover
Yep.
during that time. And then just to complete the story of Charlie's treatment, I think things went quite well from there. Is that right?
Yeah, she kind of made a steady recovery from then on, and yeah.
Was discharged to Click Sergeant in November 2019.
Yeah, and she was an outpatient for a few weeks.
And then discharged home shortly before Christmas in 2019. My lord, I think that's probably quite a natural point to stop. That's suitable.
Thank you, Ms. Arnott. We'll take a lunch break now and sit again at 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
Seem okay. We'll adjourn until 2 o'clock this afternoon.